Hello, dear students. Welcome to the program. Today, we are going to discuss one of the landmarks in the educational history of India. That is Lord Curzon's educational policy. The main objectives of today's topic are to know about the policy of education Lord Curzon has introduced, to review his Shimla Education Conference, that is 1901, to assess primary education policy of Lord Curzon, to discuss secondary education policy and assess its influence, to explain university education policy and assess its impact on higher education, and to finally describe other educational reforms made by Lord Curzon. Let us get a brief introduction. A.N. Basu remarked in his book Education in Modern India, quote, "The educational policy devised by Curzon has given a correct analysis of the brighter and darker aspects of the contemporary Indian education. But unfortunately, though the diagnosis was correct, the remedy suggested was neither appropriate nor opportune." Lord Curzon was right in many things he said, but the way in which he wanted to reform that raised grave suspicions in the minds of the educated Indians. They thought that this reform move camouflaged some deep political motive, unquote. Lord Curzon came to India in 1899 and was appointed as Governor General of India. When he came to India, it was a very crucial period of Indian history. This was the beginning of the 20th century, and severe famine and plague had crippled the social life of the people. But the people of the country started realizing the need for a system of education that would represent our national character. Several national leaders like B.G. Tilak, N.E. Besant, C.R. Das, Dadabhai Naoroji, Gokhale had emerged and helped in the development of the spirit of nationalism. The education system which the British had worked out to consolidate their rule within 4 decades produced results contrary to their expectations. The Curzon reforms reflected the fact that necessary changes had to be made corresponding to the needs of the ruling classes. The beginning of the 20th century marked a great change in the educational policy in India. The laissez-faire system of education introduced by the Wood's Dispatch of 1854 and reiterated by the Indian Education Commission of 1882 was reversed by Lord Curzon. The liberalization of educational policy during the latter half of the 19th century was viewed with distaste by Lord Curzon, as it resulted in increased criticism of governmental policies. Therefore, Curzon planned to reform the educational structure by officializing Indian education through higher control. He formulated a rather ambitious program of reforms to be introduced into the administration of the country. Everyone in the country who has had anything to do with education in India was of the opinion that the country was very backward in education and that the system of education there in vogue was defective. It laid too great stress on the literary side and did not prepare people to face the realities of life. It gave undue importance to the English language and Western modes of thought at the cost of the vernaculars and the indigenous civilization of the country. It encouraged crime at the cost of the real merit. It produced a class of imitators and left little scope or none for originality. It invited third-class men from England to fill the highest positions in the educational service of the country and placed the best native intellect and talent under them to starve and rot for want of opportunities. It did not recognize the duty of the government to look after the education of the child from the beginning until he was fit to fight his own way in the world. The educational system of the country required radical changes, but what was most needed was that the government should be prepared to spend adequate sums of money for its spread and to make it efficient. Lord Curzon pronouncements and program therefore raised great hopes in the minds of the people. His university commission was simply flooded with suggestions and statements from Indians and Anglo-Indians. The two classes, however, discussed the matter from entirely different standpoints. The Indians wanted greater facilities for education, more schools, more colleges, more masters, more stipends, an extension of primary school education, abler and better paid teachers, freedom of private enterprise, ample provision for technical and industrial education. But what they wanted the most and cared for the most was that education should be more nationalized and humanized. The Anglo-Indians wanted a curtailment of the educational opportunities, a greater and stricter control of private enterprise, and raising of university standards. Lord Curzon did go into all these questions, but the decision arrived at convinced the educated Indians that the motive which underlay Lord Curzon's policy was the tightening of governmental control, the strangling of all independence in matters educational, and the eventual weakening of all national movement and national sentiment. Dear students, let us now review the conference which was held by Lord Curzon at Shimla in 1901. Lord Curzon's educational reforms started with the Shimla Conference held in September 1901, a starting point of an era of increased educational activity and earnest prosecution of educational reforms. The conference was attended by the provincial directors of public instruction, representatives of the Christian missionaries, and a few selected educationists. But the representatives of the Indian people were conspicuously absent. The conference continued for 15 days. Lord Curzon himself presided over the conference and took a very prominent part in drafting the resolution. All total 150 resolutions were passed, which were mostly unanimous and which covered all the stages of Indian education from primary to university level. The Commission submitted its report in June 1902, and its major recommendations were enlarged legal powers to the older universities, local limits of universities, recognition of universities as teaching bodies, senate, syndicate, the faculties to be more representative of the affiliated institutions and properly constituted governing bodies for each college. Dear students, Lord Curzon in his policy considered all the aspects and levels of education, starting from primary to university levels. Let us understand what were incorporated as the new developments in various aspects of education in the light of Lord Curzon's policy. Lord Curzon's primary education policy. Lord Curzon realized the poor condition of primary education in India in terms of quality and quantity. Therefore, he gave priority to this stage of education. In the government resolution of 1904, he declared that primary education had received insufficient attention, and it was the duty of both the central and provincial governments to pay more attention for the expansion and improvement of primary education. Some of the significant steps taken by him in this regard are liberal grant in aid. Lord Curzon had realized that primary education in India had suffered mainly because of limited funds available for it. He therefore directed the provincial governments to spend larger amounts on primary education by giving necessary recurring grants to their local boards and the municipalities. He raised the government grant to local authorities from 1/3 to 1/2 of the total expenditure. He also sanctioned special grants for the diseased and famine-stricken people. Lord Curzon stopped the system of aiding primary schools on the basis of examination results, that is, payment by results, as was introduced by Hunter Commission 1882. Due to this system, primary education failed to develop substantially. Curzon introduced more scientific methods of paying grant in aid and suggested that the government should follow a more liberal policy for providing grants to primary schools. For qualitative improvement of primary education, specific importance was given on training of teachers. Steps were taken to establish training centers for primary teachers, and it was directed that the duration of training should not be less than 2 years. It was further suggested that the village school teachers should be given training in agriculture education. Lord Curzon gave importance on raising the standard of living of the primary school teachers by restructuring their pay scale. He observed that there were differences in pay scales of the teachers in different states. Curzon tried to bring the pay scale of teachers to the equal level, but he could not make it fully due to his short span of time in office. Lord Curzon wanted to upgrade the primary school curriculum. Besides teaching 3 R's, he directed to include agriculture as a subject in the primary school curriculum, as India is a predominantly an agricultural country. Physical education was another useful subject introduced in the curriculum. Lord Curzon felt that the primary school curriculum needed to be intimately related to local environment and therefore suggested that the curriculum of rural and urban schools should be different. Curzon observed that the methods of teaching in primary schools had been old and unscientific, for which children were not attracted to these schools. He tried to introduce better and scientific method of teaching like kindergarten method for the improvement of teaching. This type of method was to be adopted where competent teachers were available. Now let us discuss the assessment of Lord Curzon's primary educational policy. Actually, the policy of Lord Curzon marked the beginning of a new era in the history of primary education in India. He correctly identified that money was the main hurdle in achieving the objectives of primary education. Accordingly, he followed the policy of sanctioning liberal grants from the government funds for its expansion, and consequently, there was a considerable increase in the number of pupils attending primary schools. Curzon also stopped the discriminatory system of payment by results and introduced the more scientific method of paying recurring and non-recurring grants to remove financial difficulties. As a result of that, the number of recognized primary schools increased from 93,604 in 1901-02 to 1,18,262 in 1911 and 12. That is within a period of 10 years. Lord Curzon also tried to remove traditionalism in our primary education system and introduced subjects like agriculture and physical education in the primary school curriculum to make it more useful, practical, and modern. He made provision for training of the teachers and made their pay scale improved and uniform. Besides these, Curzon tried to introduce improved methods of teaching like the kindergarten method and gave importance on developing the reasoning power rather than mechanical memorization. By observing all these, we must admit that Lord Curzon tried to bring the spirit of modernization to our primary education. Now, Curzon's secondary educational policy. We have already discussed the primary education policy of Lord Curzon. Let us now turn our attention towards the secondary education policy and see how he wanted to improve it. Curzon's secondary education policy can be divided into 2 parts: policy of control and policy of improvement. First, we will discuss the policy of control. The Hunter Commission of 1882 suggested that the government should withdraw from the field of secondary education. Its expansion should be left to the private bodies, which were to be given liberal grant in aid. As a result, the number of private schools increased. Although the government fixed certain rules and regulations for the government-aided schools, there was no such regulation for the privately managed schools, most of which were inefficiently and poorly staffed and poorly equipped. In the Government Resolution on Education 1904, it is stated that whether these schools are managed by public authority or by private persons, and whether they have received public funds or not, the government is bound in the interest of the community to see that education provided to them is sound. The government at that time tried to control the private schools and suggested managing committee of the school should be properly constituted, financial condition of the school should be stable, school must make provision for the health and recreation of its pupils, number of teachers should be suitable and properly qualified. For establishing secondary schools in a particular area, the necessity of the school will be assessed. Every secondary school, whether government aided or privately managed, must receive recognition from the Director of Public Instruction of the concerned state. In addition to the recognition from the Education Department, it must obtain recognition from a university also if it wants to present students at the matriculation examination conducted by the university. Recognized schools will be eligible to receive government grant in aid and pupils to receive scholarships. Now let us discuss policy of improvement. Curzon realized that government control alone cannot improve the conditions of secondary education. For qualitative improvement, he adopted the measures such as provincial governments should sanction more financial grants to improve the condition of secondary schools. Government secondary schools should serve as a model for private secondary schools. Grants should be provided to private schools also to make them equal to standard schools like the public schools. The number of teacher training centers should be increased and the teachers should be encouraged to receive training. The inspectorate was to be made more efficient for effecting rigorous control over secondary education and the number of inspectors should be increased. Curriculum of the secondary schools should be modified by including practical and vocational subjects. Physical education should be included as a subject in the curriculum. Up to middle school level, the medium of instruction should be mother tongue, but the study of English must not be neglected. Importance should be given to improving discipline among students and teachers. Now let us make assessment of Lord Curzon's secondary education policy. As a whole, we may term his secondary education policy as successful because it raised the quality of secondary education. His policy to make the secondary schools receive recognition from the government as well as from the university helped in improving its quality of education. Many private secondary schools had to close down for the failure to get recognition, because of which many nationalist Indians criticized Lord Curzon for his policy and expressed that he wanted to crush nationalistic upsurge. But his strict policy helped to improve not only the quality of education but also the quality of administration of secondary schools. Secondly, as the schools had to take recognition from the university, they had to give importance on teacher training and raising the academic standards in order to send their students for matriculation examination. Thirdly, it was Lord Curzon who insisted that mother tongue should be the medium of instruction up to middle level. For these measures, many poor students were able to receive education through their own languages. This paved the way for introducing mother tongue as a medium of instruction in secondary schools in later stages. Now let us discuss Curzon's university education policy. Lord Curzon was the first person to appoint a commission on university education. On January 27, 1902, the Indian University Commission was appointed under the chairmanship of Sir Thomas Raleigh to inquire into the conditions of the universities established in British India and to consider and report upon the proposals for improving their constitution and working. The Commission submitted its report in June of the same year, that's 1902, stressing the need for reorganization of the universities. It rejected the idea of setting up new universities. Its main recommendations are as the jurisdiction of each university should be fixed and new universities should not be established. The constitution of the universities should be changed to make provisions for teaching in the universities. Undergraduate and postgraduate curricula should be introduced. Conditions for recognizing colleges should be stern. The syndicates should have about 9 to 15 members. The standard of the matric examination should be improved. Importance should be given to the study of classical languages and arrangements should be made for the best possible teaching of English. Let us have a thorough look on Indian Universities Act 1904. This act followed the earlier Act of 1902. The Indian Universities Act of 1904, passed on March 21st, was formulated on the basis of recommendations of the Indian University Commission 1902. The main provisions of this act are: universities were given the right of teaching along with the right of conducting examinations. In short, their scope was enlarged. Universities had the right to appoint teachers to conduct teaching and undertake research. They also had the right to manage their libraries, laboratories, and to make plans to develop discipline among students. Up to the moment, the number of seats in the Senate of the universities were not fixed and the government used it to make lifelong nominations. According to this act, the number was fixed. The minimum number was 50 and the maximum number was 100. Their term was determined for 5 years. The act introduced the principle of election in the constitution of the Senate. According to this act, 20 fellows are to be elected in the universities of Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay, and 15 in other universities. The act gave statutory recognition to syndicates and made provision for the adequate representation of university teachers in the university senate. The government reserved the right to make amendments and reforms and give approval to the rules framed by the senates of the university, and also it can frame regulations itself if the senate fails to frame these regulations in time. Rules in regard to granting recognition were made stricter. In order to raise the standards of the education, the syndicate could call for the inspection of college imparting higher education. Prior to this act, the territorial jurisdiction of the universities was not fixed. As a result, some colleges were affiliated to 2 universities while others were situated in the jurisdiction of 1 university but affiliated to another. Now let us make assessment of university education policy as laid by Lord Curzon. The unfortunate result of Curzon's reforms was the excessive officialization of the university administration. No doubt, Curzon was trying to bring education under the control of the government to suppress the nationalist movement in India. But his educational policy introduced efficiency and improvement in the quality of education and was the basis of the educational system for many years to come. It is clear from this discussion that Lord Curzon wanted to control the functioning of the universities and thereby break the autonomy of the universities. In the recommendations of the Indian University Commission of 1902, there was no proposal for establishing new university. Moreover, there was no representation of any Indian in the 2 commissions. Because of this, his policy did not find favor from the Indian public. Although 2 Indian members, G.D. Banerjee and Syed Hassan, were included in later stage, yet even the then Indian public did not feel happy. They doubted Curzon's intentions and felt that through his policy, the government wanted to suppress nationalism. Many private colleges had to close down because of the policy of shrinkage of higher education taken by Lord Curzon. The number of degree colleges reduced from 192 in 1902 to 170 within a span of 10 years. This had received widespread criticism, but we cannot deny the fact that Curzon gave importance to improving the standard of the quality of higher education. The credit for initiating a university improvement campaign was moving slowly but steadily towards its well-defined objectives. Dear students, let us now discuss some other reforms as made by Lord Curzon. Lord Curzon carried out several other educational reforms, and you must be familiar with these reforms also. These are agricultural education. Lord Curzon was the first person to give importance on organizing agriculture education. To this end, he took some significant moves. He declared agriculture as a subject of study at school stage, established the Department of Agriculture, created Central Research Institute at Pune, and laid down the principle that every important province in India must have its own agricultural college, which should be properly staffed and equipped. Schools of art were reformed, which had failed in their primary object of promoting Indian art. Curzon directed that the schools should be continued with certain modifications in their subjects, methods, and organization. Although the missionaries tried to incorporate religious influence in education, Lord Curzon rejected the idea and expressed in his resolution on educational policy 1904 that in government institutions, the institution is and must continue to be exclusively secular. Curzon found that the ancient monuments of India were not properly being cared for and therefore created a special department for the purpose. He also passed the Ancient Monument Preservation Act of 1904. Scholarships in large number for sending Indian students abroad for technological studies were sanctioned. The necessity of technical education in India had been felt by Lord Curzon for developing Indian industries. One of the greatest contributions of Lord Curzon in the field of Indian education was to create the post of Director General of Education in India. Dear students, let us now conclude. Lord Curzon initiated his educational reforms by holding a conference at Shimla in 1901. This was the first conference on an all-India basis, and a total of 150 resolutions were passed covering all the stages of education. First, we have focused our attention on Curzon's primary educational policy and observed that Curzon rightly identified the causes responsible for the poor condition of primary education. He took some significant steps like liberal grant in aid, abolition of the system of payment by result, teacher training, improvement of teachers' salary and curriculum, etc. As a result, the number of recognized primary schools and enrollment increased significantly. Regarding secondary education, to check the growth of inefficient private schools, Lord Curzon took certain strict measures, but at the same time, he tried to improve the quality of secondary education also. Lord Curzon set up a University Education Commission in 1902 to inquire into the condition of the universities and improving their constitution and working. On the basis of the recommendations of the Commission, the Indian Universities Act of 1904 was passed. In the last section, we have discussed other reforms carried out by Lord Curzon and assessed his contributions towards Indian education. With this, we come to the end of this lecture. Hope you have enjoyed the lecture. Thank you very much.